Commander Jake Morrison sat in his worn leather chair, feet propped up on the control panel of the defense station floating high above. Harvest Prime. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't care. He'd just finished sending out what he considered a routine message to the Galactic Council. Nothing fancy, just a quick warning that they had some unwanted visitors and might need to make some noise dealing with them. The defense station wasn't much to look at from the outside. To most aliens, it probably looked like a simple communications relay with a few basic sensors. That was exactly how the humans liked it. No point advertising what they actually had up there. The real firepower was hidden beneath layers of what looked like agricultural monitoring equipment and weather satellites. Lieutenant Amy Chen looked up from her console, fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed incoming data streams from across the galaxy. She'd been monitoring alien chatter for the past 6 months, and she'd gotten pretty good at reading between the lines of their diplomatic language. Most of the time, when other species said they had a problem, they really meant they had a catastrophic disaster that would wipe out half their population. "You really think they'll buy the pest control story?" Amy asked, pushing a strand of black hair behind her ears. She'd been born on Harvest Prime, and like most colonial kids, she'd grown up knowing that sometimes you had to be creative with the truth when dealing with outsiders. Jake scratched his beard and glanced at the tactical display, showing the edge of their solar system. 12 hours ago, their long-range sensors had picked up the distinctive energy signatures that every human military officer had been trained to recognize. The Ravager swarm moved through space like a plague, consuming everything in their path. Most civilizations ran screaming when they detected even a single swarm scout ship, but humans weren't most civilizations. "Look at it from their perspective," Jake said, taking a sip of his cold coffee and making a face. "We're just a farming colony. We grow food, we raise livestock, we mind our own business. When we say we have pests, they're probably thinking about crop-eating bugs, or maybe some wild animals getting into the grain silos." Amy laughed, a sound that would have chilled the blood of any alien who understood what humans found amusing. If only they knew what we consider pest control equipment. The truth was, Harvest Prime wasn't just an agricultural world. Sure, they grew the best tomatoes and corn this side of Earth, and their cattle were famous throughout human space. But every farming community in human territory had learned long ago that you couldn't just plant crops and hope for the best. The galaxy was a dangerous place, full of things that wanted to eat you, enslave you, or just blow you up for fun, so the farmers of Harvest Prime had prepared accordingly. Their tractors could double as mobile weapons platforms. Their grain silos were actually hardened bunkers that could withstand orbital bombardment. And their scarecrows, well, those weren't for keeping birds away. 300 light-years away, in a crystalline tower on the galactic capital world, Administrator Vextel received Jake's message through the standard diplomatic channels. The alien looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a butterfly, with delicate wings that shimmered in the artificial light of his office. His species, the Veltar, were known throughout the galaxy for their administrative efficiency and their complete inability to understand violence of any kind. The translation matrix built into Vextel's desk hummed quietly as it processed the human message. Like most galactic technology, it was designed by committee, with input from dozens of different species. The problem was that most of those species had never encountered anything quite like humans before. "Agricultural pest management assistance requested," the machine announced in Vextel's native clicking language. "Minor intervention sufficient. Standard protocols applicable." Vextel's antenna twitched with mild annoyance. Humans were always complaining about something. Their world was too hot, their neighbors were too loud, their food didn't taste right, and now they were whining about bugs eating their crops. Honestly, sometimes he wondered how they'd ever manage to survive long enough to discover space travel. He pulled up the standard response protocols for minor colonial disputes and selected 3 light patrol vessels from the nearest fleet. The ships were small, lightly armed, and crewed mostly by young officers who needed experience dealing with primitive worlds, perfect for handling whatever small problem the humans had managed to create for themselves. Deathworlders, Vextall muttered, using the term most aliens applied to species that came from high-gravity, dangerous planets, always making mountains out of molehills. Back on Harvest Prime, Jake finished his coffee and stood up, stretching muscles that had been sitting too long. Through the station's viewport, he could see the planet below, green and peaceful in the morning sun. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the system, the Ravager swarm was getting closer, but that was fine. It was Tuesday, after all, and Tuesdays were always busy on a farming world. Captain Mike Rodriguez had been drinking his morning coffee when the alarm bells started ringing throughout the destroyer New Texas. He'd barely had time to set down his mug before the ship's AI announced incoming hostile contacts at the edge of the system. Mike had commanded ships in 3 different sectors, fought pirates, smugglers, and even a few alien raiders. But he'd never faced anything quite like what was coming toward Harvest Prime. The Ravager swarm moved through space like a living nightmare. Their bioships didn't look like the clean metal vessels that most civilizations built. Instead, they were twisted organic things that pulsed and writhed as they flew, covered in what looked like scales and spines. They bred in the void between stars, turning asteroids and dead planets into nurseries for their young. When they found a world with life on it, they didn't just attack it, they consumed it, breaking it down into raw materials to build more of themselves. Captain, we've got 3 council ships dropping out of hyperspace, called out Ensign Lisa Parker from her station near the back of the bridge. Lisa was barely 22, fresh out of the Naval Academy on Earth, but she'd proven herself quick and reliable during their patrol runs. They're broadcasting on standard diplomatic frequencies. Mike glanced at the tactical display floating above his command chair. The council ships were small, probably patrol vessels with light weapons and minimal armor. They'd positioned themselves well outside the combat zone, which showed they had some sense. But they were close enough to get caught in the crossfire if things went wrong. Tell them to back off another 50,000 kilometers, Mike ordered, then turned his attention back to the approaching swarm, and remind them that we didn't ask for help. The New Texas wasn't the biggest ship in the human fleet, but she was tough and fast, with enough firepower to take on vessels 3 times her size. Her hull was scarred from a dozen battles, and her crew knew exactly what she could do. More importantly, they knew what they were willing to do to protect their home. Mike watched the tactical display as the first wave of Ravager fighters closed in on his position. The bioships moved in seemingly random patterns, but he'd studied their attack methods during the long flight out from the planet. They liked to swarm their targets, overwhelming shields and armor through sheer numbers. It was an effective tactic against most species, who preferred to fight at long range with precise, calculated strikes. But humans had never been most species. All stations, prepare for ramming speed, Mike announced calmly, as if he were ordering lunch instead of preparing to drive his ship directly into enemy contact. Engineering, I want every bit of power you can give me. Weapons, target the biggest concentration, and fire everything we've got. The New Texas lurched forward, her engines roaring as she accelerated toward the swarm fighters. Mike felt the familiar weight of acceleration pressing him back into his chair, and he couldn't help but grin. This was what his ship had been built for. Not patrol runs or escort duty, but honest-to-goodness, ship-to-ship combat, where the winner was the one still flying when the smoke cleared. Admiral Zixt watched from the bridge of his council vessel, his 4 eyes wide with disbelief as the human destroyer charged straight into the heart of the swarm formation. His species, the Keektal, had evolved on a peaceful world where the biggest predators were small creatures that ate fruit. The concept of deliberately seeking out combat was so foreign to them that their language didn't even have a proper word for it. "Admiral," his tactical officer whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "The human vessel is firing weapons that register as military-grade plasma cannons. Their energy output is off the charts." Sixth's tentacles curled with anxiety as he watched the human ship tear through swarm fighters like they were made of paper. Each blast from the new Texas vaporized entire clusters of bioships, turning them into expanding clouds of superheated gas. The humans weren't just fighting the swarm, they were dismantling it with a efficiency that spoke of long practice and careful planning. "Sir, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the planet's surface," reported another officer, his voice barely above a whisper. "They have orbital defense platforms that are powering up. The energy readings suggest weapons capable of cracking moons." Admiral Zixith felt his world shift as the implications hit him. The humans hadn't called for help because they were losing. They hadn't even called for help because they were in trouble. They'd sent that transmission as a courtesy, a polite way of telling the council to stay out of their way while they dealt with what they considered a minor inconvenience. On the bridge of the New Texas, Mike Rodriguez watched as his ship's weapons reduced, another wave of swarm fighters to glowing particles. The bioships were tough, but they weren't designed to handle the kind of concentrated firepower that human vessels could put out. Each of his plasma cannons could punch through the armor of a council battleship, and he had 12 of them. "Captain, more swarm contacts incoming," Lisa reported, her fingers flying over her console as she tracked the new arrivals. "Looks like they're bringing up their heavy units." Mike nodded, already anticipating the escalation. The Ravager swarm never sent just fighters. Once they realized they were facing serious resistance, they'd deploy their larger bioships, creatures the size of small cities with weapons that could glass entire continents. That's when things would get really interesting. "Send a message to the surface," he ordered. "Tell them we might need those orbital platforms after all." From his position on the council vessel, Admiral Zixith watched in growing horror as the human captain prepared for the next phase of battle. The translation matrix had gotten it completely wrong. This wasn't a pest control problem. This was the kind of military engagement that most civilizations couldn't survive, and the humans were treating it like a routine training exercise. The humans hadn't been understating their situation. They'd been understating themselves. Colonel Tom Bradley stood in the command center of the Harvest Moon, a massive space station that orbited Harvest Prime like a protective guardian. The station had been built using plans that officially classified it as an agricultural processing facility, complete with grain storage units and livestock monitoring systems. What the paperwork didn't mention was that those storage units could house enough ammunition to level a continent, and the livestock monitoring systems were actually targeting computers linked to weapons that could punch holes in planets. Tom had been born on a farm back on Earth, in a place where his grandfather had taught him to shoot rabbits with an old rifle, and his grandmother had shown him how to can vegetables for the winter. But that was before humanity had spread to the stars, and learned that the galaxy was full of things much worse than rabbits getting into the garden. Now, at 53, Tom commanded the defense of an entire world, and he approached the job with the same practical mindset his family had used to protect their crops. The tactical display in front of him showed the entire Harvest Prime system in 3 dimensions, with little red dots representing Ravager swarm positions, and blue dots showing human assets. To most people, it would have looked like humanity was vastly outnumbered. The swarm had thousands of bioships spreading through the system like an infection, while the humans had maybe 24 vessels and a handful of orbital platforms. But Tom had learned long ago that numbers didn't tell the whole story. "Sir, the civilian population reports full deployment to hardened positions," announced Sergeant Beth Williams from her station across the room. Beth had grown up on Harvest Prime, and like most colonial kids, she could strip down a plasma rifle blindfolded, and had been hunting dangerous wildlife since she was 12. The fact that she now held the rank of sergeant in the planetary defense Force was just a natural progression of skills. She'd been learning her whole life. Tom glanced at the readouts showing population centers across the planet. What the official records called agricultural communities were actually fortress towns built to withstand everything from orbital bombardment to biological warfare. The community centers were command bunkers. The schools were training facilities. And the farmers were some of the most dangerous people in human space. Council vessels are transmitting again, Beth reported, her voice carrying just a hint of amusement. They want permission to withdraw to what they call minimum safe distance, about 500,000 kilometers out. Tom almost smiled at that. 500,000 kilometers was barely outside the range of his longest-range weapons, but he supposed it would keep the alien observers from getting accidentally vaporized when things got serious. He'd dealt with Galactic Council representatives before, and they had a disturbing tendency to panic when humans started doing what humans did best. Grant their request, Tom said, turning his attention back to the tactical display, and tell them we're implementing standard defense protocols. Might want to mention that things could get a little loud. What Tom called standard defense protocols would have been considered acts of war by most galactic civilizations. The farming equipment scattered across Harvest Prime's surface wasn't just for growing crops. Those massive tractors could be fitted with weapons that turned them into mobile artillery platforms. The irrigation systems could spray chemical weapons, and the grain silos could launch missiles that could crack open battleships down on the planet's surface. Farmers like old Pete Richardson were doing what their families had been doing for generations, just with better equipment. Pete's great-grandfather had defended the family farm with a shotgun and a lot of determination. Pete defended his farm with a converted harvester that could fire armor-piercing rounds, the size of telephone poles, and a personal shield generator that could stop incoming artillery shells. Beth, patch me through to Surface Command, Tom ordered. I want to know status on the hunting clubs. What outsiders didn't understand about human colonies was that hunting wasn't just a hobby. On a world like Harvest Prime, where the local wildlife included creatures that could eat a full-grown bull and plants that could dissolve metal, hunting was survival training. The local hunting clubs were actually militia units that spent their weekends tracking down the most dangerous predators they could find, using weapons that most civilizations would classify as military hardware. The Galactic Council's military analysts aboard Admiral Zixith's ship watched their screens in growing amazement as human defensive positions came online across the planet. What their sensors were detecting didn't make sense according to their understanding of how civilizations were supposed to work. Agricultural worlds weren't supposed to have weapons that could threaten capital ships. Farming communities weren't supposed to be built like military fortresses, and civilian populations certainly weren't supposed to be carrying personal weapons that could punch through starship armor. Admiral, whispered the tactical officer, I'm reading energy signatures from their farming equipment that match our heavy assault vehicles. And sir, their hunting rifles are registering as anti-materiel weapons capable of engaging spacecraft. Admiral Zixt H felt his species equivalent of a cold sweat as he began to understand what they were really looking at. The humans hadn't been hiding their military capabilities. They genuinely didn't see a difference between farming and warfare, between civilian life and military preparedness. Their entire society was organized around the assumption that someone, somewhere, was going to try to kill them, and they'd better be ready when it happened. Back on the Harvest Moon, Tom Bradley watched as his defense grid powered up. The weapons platforms hidden among the space stations and orbital facilities began extending their targeting arrays, preparing to engage anything that came within range. The energy readings alone should have been enough to send most hostile forces running for the next star system. But the Ravager swarm wasn't most hostile forces. They were a plague that consumed worlds, and they didn't retreat just because their prey had sharp teeth. Tom had been expecting this fight for years, preparing for it, training his people for it. Now that it was finally here, he felt a familiar calm settle over him. The same feeling his grandfather must have had when he spotted wolves near the chicken coop. It was time to protect the farm. All stations. This is Colonel Bradley, Tom announced over the comm system. We have uninvited guests, and they're tracking mud all over our nice clean planet. Let's show them what happens when you mess with farmers. The Galactic Council analysts would later describe what happened next as the most terrifying display of controlled violence they had ever witnessed. But to Tom Bradley and the defenders of Harvest Prime, it was just Tuesday afternoon chores. Admiral Sarah Chen was 3 hours deep into her monthly paperwork when the priority message from Harvest Prime arrived at Fleet Command. She'd been reviewing supply requisitions for toilet paper and coffee rations, the kind of mundane administrative work that kept a space fleet running but made her miss the days when she'd commanded ships instead of entire sectors. The message alert chimed softly on her desk computer, marked with the standard Colonial Assistance request code. Sarah had been expecting something like this for months. Harvest Prime was located in what the military called a frontier zone, close enough to unexplored space that interesting things had a habit of wandering in unannounced. The colonists there were good people, the kind of sturdy farmers and craftsmen who'd built human civilization one world at a time, but they weren't equipped to handle everything the galaxy might throw at them, or at least, that's what she thought until she read the actual message. Minimal backup requested for pest control operation. The transmission read in the dry, bureaucratic language that colonists used when they wanted to avoid causing panic back on Earth. Request 1 heavy cruiser and standard marine complement. Situation contained but requires cleanup. No casualties reported. Thanks in advance. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decode what the colonists actually meant. In her experience, when frontier worlds asked for minimal backup, they usually meant they were about to be overrun by pirates, hostile aliens, or something worse. But the tone of this message was different. It sounded almost casual, like they were asking for help moving furniture rather than fighting for their lives. She pulled up the tactical reports from the Harvest Prime system and felt her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. The Ravager swarm, the same species that had wiped out 14 civilizations in the past century, had entered the system with what looked like a full invasion force. And somehow, the colonists had not only survived the initial contact, but had actually managed to contain the threat. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sarah called out to her aide, a sharp young officer who handled her daily schedule and kept track of which ships were where. Get me Captain Davis on the reasonable response. Tell him he's got a deployment. The reasonable response was what the Navy called a heavy cruiser, though most alien civilizations would have classified her as a battleship. She was 800 meters of reinforced armor and devastating weaponry, crewed by 500 of the most professional soldiers in human space. Her captain, Jim Davis, had been fighting various forms of space pirates and hostile aliens for the better part of 20 years, and he had a reputation for getting things done with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. Admiral, Captain Davis acknowledged when his face appeared on the communication screen. He looked like what he was, a career military officer who'd spent most of his adult life in space. His hair was going gray at the temples, and he had the kind of calm, competent expression that made everyone around him feel safer. What's the situation? Harvest Prime has a pest problem, Sarah explained, sending him the tactical data. They're requesting 1 heavy cruiser and a marine battalion for cleanup operations. Treat it as a standard colonial assistance mission. Davis reviewed the information with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. Sarah watched. His expression changed slightly as he realized what he was looking at, but to his credit, he didn't even blink when he saw that the pests were members of the Ravager swarm. Understood, Admiral Davis replied. We'll be underway within the hour. Should we coordinate with local defense forces? The colonists seem to have things well in hand, Sarah said. Just provide whatever support they need, and try not to step on any toes. You know how independent these farming communities can be. 3 sectors away, the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Committee was in full session, with representatives from dozens of species arguing over how to respond to the crisis at Harvest Prime. The Ravager swarm had been detected in human space, and according to their most optimistic projections, the human colony would be completely consumed within 48 hours. Emergency refugee ships were being prepared, and memorial services were already being planned. Admiral Zixith, still traumatized by what he'd witnessed during the initial engagement, tried to explain to the committee that the humans didn't seem to need rescue, but his reports were dismissed as shock-induced hallucinations. No single colony could stand against a swarm invasion. It was impossible. The Council mobilized their entire sector fleet, 200 ships representing the combined military might of 17 different civilizations. It was the largest military response in galactic history, and they expected to arrive just in time to document humanity's extinction. Captain Jim Davis and the Reasonable Response reached Harvest Prime 12 hours after receiving their orders. What they found was a Ravager swarm that had been systematically contained within a series of orbital kill zones, trapped like insects in a web and slowly being eliminated by the colonists' defensive systems. The humans had turned their own solar system into a giant trap, and the swarm had walked right into it. Well, I'll be damned, Davis muttered as he reviewed the tactical situation. They've actually got this under control. Major Rick Thompson, the ranking Marine officer aboard the Reasonable Response, joined the captain on the bridge as they approached the planet. Rick was a veteran of 3 different colonial conflicts, and he'd seen what the Ravager swarm could do to unprepared worlds. The fact that Harvest Prime was still in one piece, much less fighting back effectively, was something that would have been impossible anywhere else in the galaxy. "What are our rules of engagement, Captain?" Rick asked, watching as human defense platforms systematically picked off swarm bioships with weapons that seemed far too powerful for a simple farming colony. "Standard protocols," Davis replied, settling into his command chair with the confidence of a man who'd done this job many times before. "The locals have already done the heavy lifting. We're just here to help with cleanup. Try not to damage any of their farming equipment while we're at it." Rick nodded, though he was starting to suspect that the farming equipment on Harvest Prime wasn't quite what it appeared to be. The tactical readings he was seeing suggested that the colonists had enough firepower to level a small moon, all disguised as agricultural machinery and civilian infrastructure down on the planet. Colonel Tom Bradley received word that the Navy had arrived and smiled for the first time in 2 days. Not because he needed the help, but because it was nice to know that Earth hadn't forgotten about them. The Reasonable Response would make cleanup operations go faster, and her Marines could handle some of the more tedious mopping up operations that his own people were getting tired of. The Galactic Council's fleet arrived 6 hours later, expecting to find wreckage and devastation. Instead, they found the Reasonable Response conducting what appeared to be a routine training exercise, with human Marines practicing boarding operations on the few remaining swarm bioships. The crisis that was supposed to represent humanity's extinction had been reduced to target practice for junior personnel. The Council observers watched in stunned silence as human soldiers treated the galaxy's most feared predators like a minor inconvenience, something to be dealt with efficiently and then forgotten. It was a level of casual competence that none of them had thought possible. Admiral Zixth finally understood what he'd been trying to explain to the committee. The humans hadn't been lucky. They hadn't been desperate. They'd been professional. Commander Jake Morrison sat in his office aboard the defense station, staring at the paperwork that always seemed to multiply after any kind of military action. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled quietly, filling the room with the smell of fresh brew that helped him focus on the tedious task of writing official reports. Outside his window, Harvest Prime looked exactly the same as it had a week ago. green fields stretching to the horizon under a clear blue sky. You'd never know that 3 days earlier, they'd been fighting for their lives against one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. The final casualty report sat on his desk, and Jake couldn't help but shake his head as he read through it one more time. In his 20-year military career, he'd never filed a report quite like this one. Usually, after a major engagement, he'd be dealing with memorial services, medical evacuations, and damage assessments that ran into the millions of credits. This time the biggest injury had been Corporal Johnson twisting his ankle while climbing out of his power armor after the last cleanup mission. "Sir, the Galactic Council's military attache is here for the post-action briefing," announced Lieutenant Amy Chen from the doorway. She looked tired but satisfied, the way people looked after completing a job that needed doing. Over the past 3 days, she'd been coordinating communications between dozens of human ships and ground units, making sure everyone knew where the remaining swarm bioships were hiding so they could be properly dealt with. The alien military attache was a Veltar named Ketham, a nervous creature with butterfly wings and compound eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His translator device, a small silver box that hung around his neck, had been working overtime during his stay on Harvest Prime. Apparently, human military terminology didn't translate well into most galactic languages, especially when humans used words like acceptable losses and routine cleanup. "Honored Commander Morrison," Ketham began, his wings fluttering with what Jake had learned was the Veltar equivalent of anxiety. "The Galactic Council requires a full accounting of this engagement for our historical records. The elimination of an entire Ravager swarm is unprecedented in galactic history." Jake gestured for the alien to take a seat, though he noticed that Ketham's species didn't really sit so much as hover slightly above the chair. "It's pretty straightforward. The swarm showed up, we dealt with them, and now they're gone. Operation Pest Control is officially complete." "Yes, but the details, Commander. The casualties, the resource expenditure, the tactical innovations that made such a victory possible." Ketham's translator buzzed and clicked as it tried to process concepts that apparently didn't exist in his native language. "Surely there must be some explanation for how you achieved what no other civilization has managed in over 2 centuries. Jake glanced at his report one more time, then looked up at the alien with the kind of patient expression he usually reserved for explaining things to new recruits. Casualties were minimal. 2 sprained ankles and 1 bruised ego. Private Johnson slipped getting out of his mech after the last engagement. Sergeant Wilson twisted her ankle during a boarding operation, and Corporal Williams lost a bet about how thick swarm ship armor actually was. The translator device made several distressed beeping sounds before going silent entirely. Ketham stared at Jake for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting confusion and something that might have been fear. "Commander, perhaps your translator is malfunctioning," Ketham said carefully. "Did you say that your only casualties in a battle against the Ravager swarm were 2 sprained ankles and someone losing a bet?" "That's correct," Jake confirmed. "We had some equipment damage, of course. A couple of our tractors need new parts, and we'll have to replant about 50 acres of corn where one of their bioships came down. But personnel-wise, we came through it pretty clean." Jake watched as Ketham's translator struggled with the concept that humans considered the destruction of a galaxy-threatening enemy to be roughly equivalent to a barn-raising or a particularly vigorous harvest season. The little device kept making frustrated worry sounds, as if it couldn't find appropriate words in the Veltar language for what it was trying to translate. Within hours of Ketham's report reaching the Galactic Council, emergency sessions were called across 17 different star systems. Politicians, military leaders, and xenobiologists gathered in unprecedented numbers to discuss what they were now calling the human problem. The fact that it was a problem of humans being too competent rather than too primitive was something that most of them were still trying to wrap their heads around. Admiral Zixt, who had witnessed the initial engagement firsthand, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the galaxy's leading expert on human military capabilities. His testimony to the Emergency Council was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. Terrifying because it confirmed that humans possessed military technology that exceeded most civilizations' wildest dreams. Reassuring because they seemed content to use that technology exclusively for defensive purposes. The humans have designated their territory as off-limits to hostile forces, Zixt-H reported to the assembled delegates. Any species attempting aggressive action within human space should expect immediate and overwhelming retaliation. However, they have also indicated that they have no interest in expanding their territory or interfering with other civilizations' affairs. The emergency sessions resulted in what historians would later call the Treaty of Polite Distance. Human space was formally recognized as a sovereign territory with special diplomatic status. New protocols were established requiring all vessels entering human systems to request permission in advance and to approach with what the official documents called extreme diplomatic courtesy. A formal inquiry was sent to Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen, asking if humanity required any assistance, resources, or territory to ensure their continued peaceful existence in their corner of the galaxy. The galactic community was prepared to offer nearly anything to keep the humans happy and content where they were. Admiral Chen's response became legendary in diplomatic circles for its brevity and casual tone. "We're good. Thanks for asking. Let us know if you need help with anything." The galaxy's major powers spent the next several months quietly, reorganizing their military strategies around the understanding that their newest neighbors considered extinction-level threats to be minor inconveniences requiring afternoon cleanup sessions. Trade routes were redirected to avoid accidentally inconveniencing human colonies. Military exercises were moved to different sectors entirely. On Harvest Prime, life returned to normal with remarkable speed. The farmers went back to farming, the defense forces went back to their regular training schedules, and Commander Jake Morrison went back to filing routine patrol reports and dealing with the endless paperwork that came with running a colonial defense station. The only lasting change was that the local hunting club had to find new prey. Apparently, word had gotten out that human space wasn't a safe place for galaxy-threatening predators, and the really dangerous wildlife had started avoiding the area entirely. It was, Jake reflected, a nice problem to have.